Hi, I'm Richard McSpadden with the AOPA Air Safety Institute. This is another in our early analysis series, and we want to take a look at the Learjet 35 Alpha crash near Gillespie Field around the San Diego, California area last week. It's important to remember that the NTSB is early in their investigation. They could uncover facts that will change the direction of this analysis, but let's uncover what we do know and what we can ascertain from the accident at this time. The aircraft was a Learjet 35A. It requires two pilots to operate it, and it was based out of Gillespie Field. Landing distance, which will be important later on in our analysis, landing distance at about mid-weight in a Learjet 35A on a wet runway is around 3,800 feet. That seems to be a factor in this mishap. The crew on this Learjet 35A included a 42-year-old pilot in command who was typed in the Learjet, but his type rating still had a PIC limitation. Now, the FAA puts that limitation on pilots when they achieve their first type rating. It requires you to fly your first 25 hours as PIC under supervision of another PIC. Once those 25 hours are complete, the PIC will sign your logbook off. You can take that to the FAA, and then they will remove that limitation. It's very likely in this case, since this pilot was operating as PIC, that limitation was simply a paperwork lag, and that limitation had actually been removed. The second in command on this aircraft held a Learjet type rating limited to second in command privileges. There's multiple ways to earn second in command privileges. One way to earn it only requires that you fly with an instructor or a pilot in command, and they sign you off when they believe you're ready to pick up second in command duties. There's no practical test involved. Once they believe you're ready, they sign off your logbook. You then take that logbook down to your local FSDO. They'll review it and then grant you the second in command rating. It's unclear how this pilot earned a second in command rating, which appeared to be the only type rating that he held. The Learjet was on its final planned leg of the day. It was a short trip from John Wayne Airport down to Gillespie Field, and the weather at Gillespie Field was reported as 1,100 scattered with 3 miles visibility and light mist, 2,000 broken. Winds were variable at 5 knots. That 1,100 scattered doesn't appear to be the case based on what we can see from video evidence and what we saw out of the pilots in their maneuvering. It appears that there were clouds below that 1,100 scattered deck from what we can tell. The mountains surrounding Gillespie Field limit maneuvering to the north and to the east of the field, and they limit the approaches that you can fly into that field with some limitations. San Diego isn't typically thought of as a mountainous area, but in fact, the mountains that surround that area to the north and out to the east of San Diego often cause challenges for pilots in the ways of winds, turbulence, and unusual procedures and limited approaches to some airfields in the region. The crew climbed up to 11,000 feet, and from what we can tell, takeoff, climb out, and en route cruise were uneventful. As the crew approached Gillespie Field, they made a decision to fly the GPS approach to runway 17. They then canceled IFR, declared VFR, flew overhead the field at Gillespie, and essentially entered a left downwind to land 27 right. Essentially, they executed a circling maneuver at night in low visibility and what appeared to be clouds that were lower than 1,100 scattered. Now, what's challenging about that is a circling approach to runway 27 right off of that approach is not authorized, as you can see on the approach plate here. So that's the reason the pilots canceled IFR and went VFR. This appears to be a critical decision in this mishap. As they entered that left downwind for 27 right, the pilot calls the tower and asks for the runway lights to be turned up to higher intensity, and the tower responds pretty quickly to tell him the runway lights are already at full intensity. Within a couple seconds, the pilot can be heard making some frantic exclamations over the radio, and the crash occurs. Somewhere en route to Gillespie Field, as they began to prepare for the approach, the pilots realized they were facing a dilemma. To fly the GPS approach to runway 17 and land straight ahead put them on a runway shorter than what made them comfortable. It would leave no margin for error for landing distance in a Learjet 35A on a wet runway. However, circling off that approach to the longer runway 27 right, which added an additional 1,200 feet of runway, was not authorized. The pilot makes a decision that his solution to this is to fly the GPS approach, get visual with the field, and then cancel IFR and proceed in a night VFR pattern. It seems likely that the demanding nature of this maneuver caught him off guard. The weather, it appears that the weather was lower than what was forecast, just based on how low he got. ADSB data shows him maneuvering to about 400 to 500 feet as he comes over the runway and enters the downwind to 27. You really wouldn't do that on a circling approach. When you're flying a circling approach, you will take every bit as much altitude as you can get without going back into the weather, and you'll take every bit as much horizontal separation as you can get without losing sight of the runway. Those two factors, having to stay low enough to stay out of the weather and having to stay close enough so that you can keep sight of the runway, are what makes circling approaches so difficult. In essence, it eliminates your turning room both in the vertical and in the horizontal. And that's why we occasionally see these stall spin type of accidents on circling approaches when pilots get caught too tight to the runway. It's early in the NTSB's investigation, and they could uncover facts which change this analysis. But at this stage, it looks like a pilot flying a demanding circling approach in a Learjet in limited visibility and low ceiling conditions lost control of the airplane and a stall spin occurred. The interesting question will be, if this holds, why did the stall spin occur? Did it happen while the pilot was looking over his left shoulder, trying to gain visual with the runway in a crowded environment with likely a lot of light pollution, which could have camouflaged the runway? Did that distract him and the co-pilot from the airspeed indications? We don't know that yet at this stage. It'll be interesting if we can hear a cockpit recorder if they have one. Or did the pilot lose sight of the airfield, and in losing sight of the airfield, perhaps he regained sight of the airfield real quick and maneuvered too aggressively in maneuvering for that turn to final? That part's unknown, but that'll be the question to understand: is if a stall spin occurred, why did it occur? And the thing that kind of is concerning about this theory, a little bit of a disconnect, is if you look at the ADSB data, the pilot flew very close to VREF on his approach down to the GPS on runway 17, looking at his airspeed off ADSB. He flew overhead the field and accelerated up to about 130 knots. VREF is around 122 knots in a Learjet, in that ballpark for where they were flying. As he entered once he went on the go from runway 17 to enter that downwind to 27, he accelerated and maintained 130 knots or above throughout the maneuver. So one of the troubling questions that'll have to be answered is, if he lost control and the stall spin occurred, then how did that occur when it appears as if he kept his airspeed up? One of the factors could have been his configuration. We don't know yet what his configuration was as he came down flying the approach runway 17 and then went on the go. And did he maintain that configuration as he flew up into the left downwind for runway 27? His configuration there would make a big difference in the stall speed and the handling characteristics of the Learjet under these conditions. Another thing we didn't hear was the pilot held the microphone down during the latter part of this accident, and we don't hear any kind of stall warning or sink rate warnings or anything in the background going off in the cockpit. This does seem something that needs to be investigated as to potential disconnects to the theory of a stall spin accident. I think the NTSB is also very likely to look at spatial disorientation for this accident. So in an area like Gillespie Field, where there were mountains to the north and to the east of the airfield, as the pilot's flying that approach, and remember, limited visibility conditions, mist, he's having trouble picking up the runway. If he's looking at his left and glancing forward and trying to pick up, maintaining his attitude by visual reference, Lights on a hillside can blend into lights on the ground in mountainous areas and give you a false sense of a horizon. So there is a potential that during this maneuver, as he's transitioning from looking over his shoulder to looking back ahead and out the front of the airplane, that he got a sense of a false horizon from lights in the distance, from stars, from lights on the hillside or traffic. All of those can blend for a false horizon effect under these kinds of conditions when visual acuity is low, which it certainly was this night. And a third area the NTSB will investigate is airframe and engine operation. It doesn't appear to be a factor in this flight, but they'll want to rule that out entirely as best they can determine the engines were running fully and operating normally throughout the flight, as were the flight controls, and that was not a contributing factor to this accident. It doesn't appear to be, but I'm sure they'll run that down and completely eliminate it. So for this accident, a crew on their planned final flight of the day, coming home at night, face a dilemma. Land on a runway that doesn't give them the landing distance they're comfortable with, or circle to land to a longer runway at night in marginal VFR conditions. The challenge they faced was circling to land 27 right wasn't authorized, so they developed a workaround, and their workaround was to cancel IFR and go VFR. The problem with that is they back themselves into a corner. Now that they've canceled VFR, if they lose sight of the field, which it appears they may have on downwind, or at the very least they were struggling to keep sight of the field, they had no ability now to go missed approach because they were off of an IFR clearance. And so they were cornered into keeping sight of the airfield and staying with the direction that they'd chosen. And it appears as if that train of thought, that decision, is likely the critical decision for this mishap. What's really uncertain here, and I hope the NTSB can uncover, is what was the co-pilot doing? Well, the pilot in command is looking out his left side, trying to keep sight of the runway and struggling to do so. The co-pilot should have been focused on the flight instruments, the airspeed, the attitude indicator, and if necessary, making callouts to the pilot when those occurred. Whether or not that occurred and why it didn't occur will be an interesting point of discussion for crew coordination for people flying all kinds of airplanes. The whole benefit of flying with a crew is under those kind of demanding scenarios to be able to share the workload to keep the airplane safe. It's likely the NTSB and the FAA both will take a look at the training of both the pilot in command and the co-pilot, and they will take a look at that procedure of flying in a GPS approach to runway 17 and canceling at night, and in essence, flying a circling approach. The workaround of canceling IFR to go VFR to do that gets around the intent of preventing that kind of maneuver, and it's very likely they'll take a long, hard look at that for future operations at Gillespie Field. Stay tuned, and as things develop, we'll update you on this accident through our various Air Safety Institute channels. Thanks for watching, and thanks for supporting AOPA and the Air Safety Institute.